Are aging populations a problem? Despite a global population growing by more than 80 million annually, news reports are more likely to focus on the problem of declining human populations. Today on The Population Factor, we explore this question with a focus on Japan. Our guest is Peter Mattanley, senior lecturer in Japanese studies at the University of Sheffield. As the nations of the world work to create sustainable societies, stabilizing and in some cases reducing populations is a necessity. But declining populations are typically reported in the media as a problem, even as a crisis. My guest today has a different perspective. Peter Mattanley is senior lecturer in Japanese studies at the University of Sheffield. Peter, welcome to The Population Factor.
Hi, Phil. Thank you very much for having me on your program.
So there have been many thousands of news stories in the West in recent years about Japan's population crisis. Is Japan's population declining? And if so, how long has that been happening? How much has it declined in recent years?
Well, Japan's population has been declining more or less for about the past 10 to 15 years. So officially it started declining in around 2008. At the moment, it's not a rapid decline because we're at the peak, if you like, of a very long and gentle curve of population increase and then decrease into the future. And we're at the peak of that curve now, which means that the rate of population decline per year in Japan is still quite small, quite low, but we expect that the rate of population decline will increase in the years to come to be quite rapid. Probably, if current projections are borne out in reality, and we don't really know what's going to happen in the future, of course, but if current projections are borne out in reality, then probably the Japanese population by around 2035, around that time, will be declining somewhere in the region of 750,000 to 1 million people per year.
And that's on top of a population of, what, about 115 million?
Well, at that time, it will be less than it is now. The Japanese population in total right now is about 125, 126 million. But by that time, yes, certainly, it'll be around 115 million by that time. We expect that by 2050, the Japanese population may indeed have dropped to under 100 million, although the government wants to avert that by allowing for, if you like, a softer landing to about 100 million by mid-century.
So how do Japanese people feel about this? Do they see fewer people as a problem or a good thing?
Generally, policymakers, at least those that are most involved in the political economy, see depopulation as either a problem or even a crisis, as you mentioned at the top of the program. And that's because both aging and depopulation are predicted to increase government costs, particularly in the realms of caring for the elderly and so on.
Peter, let me break in here because our viewers might not understand what we mean by aging. When you say an aging population, that's simply more of the total population are in older age brackets, correct?
That's right. That's being pushed by two things. One is people are just getting older, people are living longer, which means that more of their life is spent, a greater proportion of each person's life is spent as an older person. But also that's being driven by fewer children being born. So a greater proportion of the population as time moves on, as fewer children are being born, so the proportion of the population of older people increases.
Now, you've written about a depopulation dividend. So you've written that fewer people can actually bring benefits. What do you mean by a depopulation dividend?
Well, basically, it's whether we can derive socioeconomic gains or benefits from a falling human population or a shrinking population worldwide. There are actually many countries in the world that are on the cusp of depopulation. The most important one of those, perhaps, is China, which is, of course, by population, the largest country in the world. China is approaching its peak and following roughly similar population-wise, similar developmental path to Japan through the 21st century. And it's possible that, for example, depopulation could result in lower resource consumption or less resource consumption. Less consumption of fossil fuels can contribute also, therefore, to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions,
right,
as well as perhaps as people withdraw from the land in certain parts of Japan and other countries, maybe that will result in, or could be used to result in greater biodiversity benefits, a biodiversity bounce back, if you like.
So what are some of the possible social benefits of smaller populations?
Well, as you and your viewers might already know, Japan's cities are very large and very crowded. And there's an enormous pressure on infrastructure and services and so on in those places. It's possible that, for example, if the population of Japan were to decline significantly, and it will do by mid-century, by more than a quarter probably, there'll be opportunities for reconfiguring living space, possibly for people to have more space to live in and to alter the space that they're already living in.
So when I think of Japanese cities, one of the pictures that leaps to mind are the very, very crowded train stations and people sort of being shoehorned into the trains. Japan is one of the most densely populated countries in the world, I believe. So I could see how there'd be benefits in terms of less crowding. So what are some of the real costs of decreasing populations?
Well, as I mentioned before, one of the biggest costs would be as the population ages with depopulation. The aging and depopulation come hand in hand, if you like. Of course, the costs of caring for an older population in terms of health and welfare and pension will increase. As for example, corporations and their pension plans will be affected, as well as families and individuals will have to adjust the way they use their money through their lifetime in order to accommodate a changing financial landscape, I think.
Are those costs bearable? I mean, as you look at the most likely population trajectory for Japan over the next 30 or 40 years, how do those costs stack up? Bearable, manageable costs, or do the Japanese really have to find ways to shrink more slowly?
Well, in terms of financial sustainability, particularly for the government, I think the costs are actually more bearable than some people predict. One of the things is that as we live longer lives, we also live healthier lives and more active lives in our older age. And more older Japanese who are reaching what we might call a standard retirement age of 60 to 65, more and more older Japanese, as they reach those ages, are wishing to continue to work. And actually more are thinking about working through even into their 70s. Not necessarily because they have to, because they need the money, but actually more because of personal interest in keeping active and being able to get out and lead, if you like, a social life through their work. So I think more and more older Japanese are continuing to work. So the impacts of an aging and declining population on pension payments and health and welfare payments will probably not be as great as some of the more, if you like, pessimistic predictions say.
If we're thinking about the positive impacts of declining populations, obviously environmental benefits spring to mind. Can you tell us a little bit about examples where the Japanese have really embraced declining populations? I know you've written about Sado Island, for instance.
Yes, I mean, I think there are two ways, environmental and social, where Japan has really, I think, it is I wouldn't like to say leading the way, but at least is thinking seriously and dealing in a calm and mature manner with aging and depopulation. The first, environmentally, is that actually in a lot of local areas in rural Japan, many of your viewers might have an image of Japan as this very densely populated urban landscape. And of course, Tokyo and Osaka and Nagoya and cities like that, that's what they are.
Right.
But actually, the lived density of Japan is much lower. And that's because quite large areas of the country are relatively unpopulated. Forested mountainsides, small communities, fishing villages along quite isolated coastlines and these sorts of places. And these are the places where aging and depopulation are occurring most severely, if you like, or the issue is most pronounced.
Right.
And these are the places where many people in these sorts of communities, Sado Island being one, which is in the Japan Sea, located between the island of Honshu and the far eastern coast of Russia. In places such as Sado Island, they understand quite deeply that there's no returning to population growth for them. It's a given that in the future their population will continue to shrink and it will continue to age. But by resigning themselves to that, what I think they've been able to do is to get over the obsession with growth or the growth first mentality that still dominates the political and economic elites in Tokyo. And they've been able to sort of put aside those priorities and preferences and prioritize and preference other issues such as health and well-being, getting outside and enjoying oneself, social life, and enjoying what they have, and particularly also enjoying the nature that's around them.
Right.
So there are quite a lot of developments in places such as Sado where farmers are turning towards organic farming methods, and they are working very hard to create a much cleaner environment, to reduce the amount of pesticides and insecticides they use. And also local governments too are doing the same thing to improve not just the environment within which humans are living, but also slightly beyond that into the more rural, forested surroundings of many of these communities.
So it's interesting. In the United States, we often see a bit of a disconnect between the power brokers and the general population. We're all sort of caught up in a growth economy, but I think the leaders want to grow, continue to grow as fast as possible in many cases. The general populace is often much more ambivalent about this growth. Is there sort of a similar dynamic in Japan?
Well, I think, yes, the leaders in the political economy in Tokyo most certainly are growth-oriented and remain so. And actually, in general, in politics throughout Japan, it's very, very hard for... Japan is a democratic country like the United States, and it's an open society like the United States. And consequently, in that sense, it's very, very hard for a politician to get up on the stump at election time and advocate for shrinkage, particularly of the economy, of course.
Right.
And that would be electoral suicide for nearly everyone who tried to do that. But nevertheless, Japanese, even the leaders in the political economy, and I've been in conversation with some of them at quite a senior level, they understand the situation because they've been told about it, and they know that depopulation, not only is it inevitable in the future, it's actually happening right now.
Right.
And they know that it is going to accelerate. So they need to plan for it, and they need to accommodate that in their policies once they've become elected. But amongst ordinary people in Japan, I think there is, as you say, a considerable amount of ambivalence about this. The realization that we've reached the limits to growth is percolating very broadly across the Japanese population. And a lot of people in these rural areas, as I said, they know that their communities are not going to grow, however much they try. So they're abandoning the idea of growth as a priority, and they're focusing on other things as a result.
So that seems to me a fairly hopeful development because, as you say, we've sort of exceeded the environmental limits to growth in many parts of the world. More and more people are saying in the world as a whole, when you see climate change, species loss. So if we're pushing up to or past environmental boundaries, we're going to have to think about not just stabilizing, but in some cases stepping back in terms of population, perhaps in terms of economic activity. So it seems like a hopeful thing to me that a very successful, wealthy society is able to start decreasing in size. Now, of course, as you say, it's one thing to talk about a slowly decreasing population. It's another thing to talk about a rapidly decreasing population. I would think then the problems would be harder to deal with. What are some of the measures that Japanese leaders are taking or considering to slow population decline?
Well, there are two main issues that the Japanese government is dealing with in terms of the impacts of depopulation on the political economy. The first is they are working very hard to increase the participation of women in the labor force. So historically in Japan, the labor force has been divided between, if you like, a core male labor force and a peripheral female labor force. And that kind of peripheralization of the female labor force has led to, is one contributing factor to productivity in Japan actually being quite low in comparison with similar advanced industrialized democracies. So they're drawing a lot more women into the labor force, and a much higher proportion of women are now participating in the formal economy, and not just as non-regular peripheral workers, but as core workers. So that's one thing that they're doing.
But I could see a problem there because, on the one hand, bringing women into the labor force will increase your labor force and help you economically that way. But then there's a conflict between raising children and working the long hours that I believe Japanese workers are typically expected to work.
That is absolutely the case, yes. And these kinds of tensions are, the government is trying to work with them, but one of the problems is, first of all, if you like, the relative independence of corporations and management to government action on these issues, and also very, very deeply ingrained working cultures, which predominantly are male working cultures. But Japanese are dealing with this, I think, quite well, because the rate of participation of women in the labor force has increased very substantially over the last 10 to 15 years. And part of the reason for that is the government trying to get women into more productive roles in the formal economy in order to cope with the rising costs of an aging and decreasing population. Though I must say, and you kind of alluded to this in your comment, that there is also a limit or a boundary to this in terms of the sustainability of the increase in female labor participation, because there is a limit to which, beyond which you can't go in terms of the percentage of people of a certain age, of working age, for example, who are actually involved in the economy. And I think we may be starting to reach that limit now with women. The other way that the Japanese government is moving on this is very, very slightly and very, very tentatively increasing the number of people that are welcomed or allowed into Japan as workers, as migrant workers from other countries. As you may know, Japan traditionally or historically has been a low immigration country.
Right.
And I'm not saying at all that it's becoming a high immigration country right now. It isn't. But certainly the number of people coming into Japan and joining the labor force, particularly from other Asian countries, has been increasing in recent years. And that, to some extent, will give Japan, as I mentioned before, a sort of a softer landing to the problems that might ensue as a result of rapid depopulation.
As Japan takes that step to increase the numbers of foreign workers, Are they looking primarily to sort of bring in guest workers, sort of the model in the Middle East, and or are they looking to bring in permanent immigrants who would then become citizens and whose children would become citizens?
Well, to a very large extent, the people that Japan is welcoming at the moment are assumed to be on sort of guest workers. I mean, they haven't called them that. They're not labeled in that way, but nevertheless, they're brought in from other Asian countries such as Vietnam, China, Philippines, Indonesia, on trainee visas and other temporary working visas. A lot of these visas are, for example, to study visas and so on. And it's expected that most of those people will eventually end up returning to their home countries and settling down and living the rest of their adult lives there. However, the Japanese government, they are aware that quite a lot of these workers, who knows what proportion, but certainly a proportion of these workers do want to remain in Japan or will want to remain in Japan once they get there and find out that, and maybe they'll meet a Japanese and fall in love and want to get married and so on, all these sorts of things, start their own family in Japan.
Sure.
And that is happening right the way across the country. The Japanese government is very aware that this sort of thing is happening. They're not encouraging it, but then again, they're not discouraging it. They're just remaining silent on it.
Well, as you said toward the top of our show, I mean, it's interesting because Japan is a large, important country. I mean, the third largest economy in the world, 10th most populous country in the world. But it's also important because Japan is sort of a bellwether toward this trend. More and more countries' populations are plateauing, starting to decline in some cases. And the projections from the United Nations are that over the coming decades, more and more countries will follow this path. So it's kind of important that we're having new models for how to deal with this trend. And of course, many of us would want to encourage it for environmental reasons. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. As you say, this is an issue for Japan, it's an issue for the world, and we're going to have to keep working through ways to deal with this and turn it to good use. So, Peter, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your knowledge. Thank you for being on The Population Factor.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much.